Hi everyone, my name is Monica. I am the president of Suit Up, and today is our first video series of our 5-part series. Joining us today is Tania from the Haskeen Career Center. I've known her for about 2 years now, and I had attended her workshop regarding I guess, like the development of one's career path. So I'm glad to have her on board. And I guess, Tania, if you want to do any introduction, feel free, and then we can get started.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Monica. Thank you for having me here today. As Monica said, my name is Tania Jamault, and I'm a part of the Haskeen Career Development Center here at Haskeen. I advise on several things, but my passion is certainly on LinkedIn and online branding from a candidate perspective. So while I was sent a few questions to answer today, I am, as Monica mentioned, open to answer any questions. Perhaps what I'll do is I'll maybe get started on the 5 questions I was sent, just to give us a bit of a groundwork for some information about where I can provide some advice. As Monica mentioned, you're welcome to drop your questions in the chat or simply unmute yourself if I've overlooked something or missed something. So the first question that I received was, how can a student best prepare their resume in the face of COVID? So my first recommendation for students, particularly those at Haskeen, is to utilize our 24/7 service called VMock. VMock is an online resume review tool that assesses the impact, your content, and the format of your resume within 30 seconds. And trust me, I do this for a living, and that computer program does it way faster than me. The nice part about this program is that it gives you a score based on the database within VMock, and that database is all from Haskeen students. So we built it with resumes from our students, so it's an accurate depiction of where your resume sits amongst your competition. So step 1. Step 2 is to book an appointment with one of your 4 career development specialists. Haskeen students have the luxury of having their own in-house business-focused career center. So coming to see a person, we can certainly tailor and target that based on where you're going with your career. My third recommendation is actually to follow resume writers on LinkedIn. They will always post information about new trends. They'll post information about certain buzzwords to avoid, depending on what industry you're going into. And they're just a really great resource to have sort of on the fly. I also suggest with resumes that students have a 1-page resume and a 2-page resume prepared. Some industries ask for 1-pagers, and some would prefer to see the breadth of your experience. And so having 1- and 2-page resumes prepared in advance can save you a lot of time when you are submitting your applications. And the last advice that I have is, if you wanted to go more creative on your resume, whether that is a monogram of your initials, columns, bolding, colored font, try to make sure that it's not too cluttered, and consider moving to 2 pages if your columns are becoming a bit too narrow. The second question I received was, how can students take advantage of LinkedIn while in this situation, remote and everyone being isolated, and what tips and tricks would I recommend using? So the first step in terms of taking advantage of LinkedIn, which, as I mentioned, is my passion. The first is, make sure your profile is completed. A lot of students will simply log on to LinkedIn, put in some information, and sort of leave it sitting. That does not do you any good. Completed profiles will actually come up higher in a recruiter search results. So understand the algorithm that's there and make sure your profile is complete. The second step is making it strategic. So what I mean by that is, depending on where you're going in your career, you want to have certain buzzwords, keywords, words that are affiliated with the jobs you're going into. As an example, let's say you're going into finance, and you were interested in the stock market, investments, managing someone's portfolio. You need to have those words everywhere on your profile, from your headline to your summary to past job experiences, even courses that you've taken in the academic world that can relate to where you're going. Now, oftentimes these keywords, students will say, Tania, I'm not sure which ones to use. Go look at a job board. Look at your dream job in a job posting and pull some keywords that you see there. Make sure that you sort of sprinkle it on your profile. The third is using LinkedIn to engage with employers. LinkedIn has an amazing feature for recruiters. When they search for a candidate, they can select to only see candidates that follow their company on LinkedIn and engage with their brand, meaning they comment, share, or like content created by the company. And so if you're not engaging with a potential employer and they check off that box, you're unfortunately out of the running just based on that. The other thing I would say is to use it every day. Another algorithm on LinkedIn, when a recruiter searches for a candidate, the candidates that use the profile every day or within 2 days will actually come up in the search results higher than those who are stagnant on the platform. And so as a recruiter, time is money. They need to recruit and fill that seat right away. And so why would they reach out to someone that hasn't been on the platform for 2 months? It doesn't add up. So as a student, it is important as often as you're checking TikTok, as often as you are on Instagram, you need to be on LinkedIn just as often and engaging with content, whether that's from your connections, as I mentioned, employers, classmates, alumni, etc. So that was kind of a blend of how to take advantage of LinkedIn and what tips I have while I would recommend while using it. The third question is, how can students continue networking while isolated from in-person contact? Great news, it's the same. The only difference is that you're not physically meeting them at a coffee shop, but you're meeting them over Zoom. 99% of the time, individuals are fairly receptive to making more meetings because they don't have to worry about travel and commute. They can jump from one platform to the next, one meeting to the next. So you'll actually be surprised on how much time people, industry professionals, alumni, students who are in year 4 or 5, they have more capacity to make up for some networking. Now, the good news is that if you are located in Calgary, Alberta, there are some spots that are open. Some restaurants have patios that are open. And so you could always suggest meeting in person if that was a preference to you. But you have to keep in mind that it is a preference for both yourself and the person that you're meeting. You obviously don't know if they have people that are in a high risk category to contract anything, or if they're maybe homebound because they have children or other dependents in the household. So I would always recommend when you're reaching out to someone to set up a date, a networking opportunity is what I meant to say. It's a kind of a coffee date, sort of. Always ask what their preference is. If it's in person, virtual, some people have even networked just on a phone call. So always ask what their preference is. The other thing too to keep in mind is that when you're networking with someone, it's always pivotal to ask what the frequency of contact should look like. So for example, for myself, I have a mentee and I only need to meet with her every 3 months or so. But that's something and a cadence, I guess, we've determined together. So some students fear I have to meet with someone and then I don't know how to follow up. I don't know when to have another meeting. You can always ask the person, when is appropriate for me to follow up for our next meeting? Because I really appreciated our dialogue, or I learned a lot from our conversation today. So always keep that in the back of your mind when you're networking. Question number 4, are there any new skills that employers are looking for in resumes because of the transition to remote work, and how can one develop these skills? So it's not a surprise that I'll tell you that technical skills are probably the most sought out skill right now in the business world. For the last year or two, we've had employers come to our school and request that our business students receive simple coding skills, Python, JavaScript, HTML, anything of that sort to really complement your business acumen. Now, the good news about computer literacy is that there are a lot of programs online that you can take through Google Analytics, LinkedIn Learning, sometimes Harvard. I've seen they've thrown out some online courses that students and the general public can register for. Coursera. Lots of resources out there for you to learn maybe some of the preliminary and basic foundational things about coding, what the difference is between Python and HTML. Sort of that developing piece is really critical. The second sought out skill that we've seen an increase is data analytics. And so, excuse me. might just have a sip of water. I get really excited when we talk about career development. So obviously I just needed a second there. So as part of your curriculum, especially those that attend Haskeen, there's a huge focus on Excel and data analytics from that perspective. But what employers are looking for is that analytical piece, but the ability to understand what the data means. So really, what is the story behind the numbers and the graphs and the charts and everything like that? So if you're not a part of the Haskeen community or part of the faculty, I would suggest looking into data analytical skills on those platforms that I said before, or even further, you might even be eligible to take some of those Haskeen courses as part of your program outside of Haskeen. And another hot tip I would recommend, data visualization tools such as Power BI or Tableau are heavily used in the workplace. So I strongly recommend looking into that. Okay, last question here. What should students aim to include within their LinkedIn profiles? As I mentioned a bit earlier, the strategic piece of your profile is really specific to you and where you want to go in your career. So as I mentioned before, using keywords, following and engaging with the right companies, using the platform every day, staying connected. Those are all things you can do on LinkedIn to stay, above the rest. But remember, as I mentioned, when you create your profile, it's not a stagnant assignment. It's not submit, you get the grade and you're done. Your LinkedIn profile should evolve as you evolve, right? I'm confident to say none of us are the same people that we were pre-pandemic. We've gone through an evolution, whether that's interest areas, competencies, strengths, even switching careers entirely. And so your profile needs to mirror who you are in person. It's sort of your online validity tool that recruiters use to determine your validity and if there is some consistency between your documents and that. Said that, those are the questions that were provided in advance. I am open to answering questions on the floor or building off anything that I've said today.
Thank you, Tania. My name is Karen. I'm the VP Marketing for Suit Up. And the question that I have for you is, when we go back to our regular way that we used to go upon before the pandemic, what would you suggest to individuals who have difficulty with socializing? Like, what tips would you give for them? Because now that it's been social distancing, they probably have this sort of anxiety to socialize with others. What types of tips do you have for them?
Yeah, great points, Karen. It's funny that you say that because it's often something that comes up in appointments with students, is that the introverts tend to be more hesitant to network and chat with people. And I'm here to tell you that introverts make the best networking professionals. Networking is about gathering information and insights. And as an introvert, you tend to think a lot and you might naturally have more questions than an extrovert. An extrovert would want to talk your ear off, but an introvert is a little bit more introspective. And so having questions prepared in advance can help combat those jitters. What is the purpose of my meeting? When I have my purpose, I'm okay to end the meeting. Have an agenda for your meeting when you're meeting with that individual. If there is some hesitancy on, you mentioned that social awkwardness of going back to being in person, remember that every single person on this planet has been impacted at some point by COVID. And so some of your fears or hesitations or maybe uphill battles with facing someone face to face, the other person might be feeling the same way. And so my suggestion is to always be very humble and express if you're nervous, express if you're excited, express if it's been a while since you've done that. Showing that sense of humility can be a really easy way to make a connection with someone when you're meeting with them. The other thing too is you can always ask questions with the other person. How comfortable are you meeting in person? Are you okay if we talk on the phone first and then we see if this is worthwhile to meet in person? Right? It's funny how when students ask me a lot of questions about the business world and career planning and career, development, there are a lot of parallels with dating and career development. And so it's an interesting parallel about, asking for consent and sussing things out and making sure you know why you're meeting. Do you have the same values? Do you both want something out of the interaction? And so it has to be a mutually beneficial interaction, right? As I mentioned, I have a mentee, and I get a lot of gratification as a mentor providing support and advice to this mentee. And so the mentee had to articulate what she was hoping to get out of it. And I hope to get out of it is to see her growth. So we've had to articulate that to one another. So does that answer your question, Karen, or is there something I could elaborate a bit more on?
Yeah, I think you definitely answered the question. I definitely do have a follow-up. I'm not too sure if you talked about it. So one of the things is that like now that we were stuck in the pandemic since March, what types of skills would you recommend to put on LinkedIn since some students may have missed the opportunity like in-person events?
Yeah, another great question. So it's a two-parter. One is that your profile skills need to be reflective to obviously where you're going in your career. And so a lot of those might be industry or function based. So again, as I mentioned in finance, you probably want to put, pivot tables or stock market or investment portfolios. Those are, more of the career skills. Now, what you don't reckon, the second part is that throughout this pandemic, you've learned a lot of soft skills. And I hate that they're called soft skills because they're the hardest ones to craft. Things like personal resiliency, effective problem solving, increased communication skills, right? We're now saturated with the screen in front of us all the time. So you've had to learn how to self-regulate, your screen time or communication, even this sort of ideal of hyper communication. I'm currently a student right now, and I find that I'm connected with my classmates on 5 different platforms, including email, text, WhatsApp, Instagram, the whole gamut. And so you've actually developed a lot of those soft skills. Now, if we throw it back to LinkedIn, the platform is very smart. And what I mean by that is when you go to add a skill on LinkedIn, when you start typing, it'll auto populate, just like Google, certain skills. And so I always tell students, the wheel's already invented. Why would you try and figure out what skills you have? Start typing a few letters and see what LinkedIn auto populates for you. And ask yourself, where would I have developed this skill? So let's say you start typing teamwork or team, and teamwork comes up. You can assess that even though you may not have found an internship or a contract working for an employer, you developed that skill in the classroom. And in fact, it was probably exponentially developed by having to be remote. So it's a two-parter for sure, but generally speaking, I suggest students have about 30 skills or more. LinkedIn caps out at 50. And then when you're selecting those skills, always select the drop down. When you select the drop down, it codes your profile with that tag. And when recruiters look to find candidates, they select the same tags from their drop down. And that's how you can match with a recruiter search.
Yeah, thank you, Tania. I'll pass it on to anyone who has any further questions. I think I'll jump in. So I guess Karen and Tania, you had discussed the skills that you should be putting on LinkedIn. But as someone that gets their skills mainly from extracurriculars, we also see that with the current situation, in-person activities to allow for these skills to be developed have been, I guess, short in supply. So how would you recommend students to build these skills, even if I guess the extracurriculars are not available? What other kind of outlets can students utilize? I know you had mentioned developing technical skills through like Harvard courses or Coursera's courses. Are there any other outlets you would recommend for students to be able to distinguish themselves from others if extracurricular activities are really not available for them?
Yeah. Loaded question, that's for sure. I have several answers for that. Where do I begin? Okay, so the first is how to differentiate yourself from your competition. I would argue that going the extra mile and finding those courses outside of your curriculum will automatically make you stand out. So again, on your LinkedIn profile as a recruiter, looking to see where your education lands, but what additional courses or certificates did you complete that's maybe outside of Haskayne? So I guess what that shows to an employer is that you are a go-getter, right? You are incentivized and motivated to expand your skill set. So automatically doing that sets you apart. The second piece that you said, there's a lack of opportunity for students, and I would almost beg to differ. While it's different from what it was, 2 years ago when I delivered a similar workshop for Suit Up, there are more than opportunities out there. It's just a matter of being a bit more creative. So what I suggest to my students and students who come to see me, generally speaking, is try to think about your interest areas, right? So while on campus feels a little desolate, it's hard to feel engaged, getting engaged in something you're already passionate about is a no-brainer. So, let's say you're interested in animal welfare. Why not reach out to the Calgary Humane Society and see if you can answer emails on their behalf? Maybe you can screen phone calls for them. Maybe you can help with cleaning duties as part of, a COVID mandate for their facilities. You could even look online. I'm sure there's some GoFundMe pages or groups or communities that get together. I have a student with her community. She gathered students who were in high school last summer when they didn't have anything to do, and they did a little grocery drive for the local seniors complex or long-term care facility in their community. And so it's a chance to showcase your initiative without it necessarily being a formal opportunity. And so as a student, I think it requires a bit of creativity to find the informal opportunities, because you still have access to the formal opportunities. They just look a little bit different. The other element to that is because the world, and I would maybe narrow it down to Canada, most of Canada is still working remotely. Because of that, employers now have a larger candidate pool for their talent, right? And if you notice on LinkedIn, as soon as you click remote for the type of job, you have access to way more jobs, even just being located in Calgary. So access to industries in retail, fashion, more marketing agencies, learning and development, diversity and inclusion, and equity. There's so much more opportunity outside of the Calgary walls that you're exposed to. But you are right, Monica. It does look different, but it does require that creativity from a student lens to seek out these opportunities. When I would say maybe a year and a half ago, it was a little bit more cookie cutter of where you could go. And so I think that's the biggest challenge for your generation is you have to now seek out those opportunities much quicker than your peers that came before you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that really answers the question in detail. If our VP events, Hernie, or consultant Farhan, if you guys want to jump in and ask questions, you're more than welcome to.
Hi, Tanya. So I actually did have a question for you as well. I'm not sure if it's a bit off topic, but my question is that if you have any tips for interviews, especially now that most of them are online?
It's great to see you again, Hernie. It's been a few years for sure since we've seen each other. But yeah, I do have several tips. The first tip is to be flexible. Some companies will have one-way video interviews, and some will prefer two-way video interviews. So the one-way video interview is an asynchronous interview, meaning that you will get prompted with questions and you have to speak to your webcam. It's a very bizarre process and it's not comfortable for anyone. I'm a career practitioner and that gives me anxiety to do a one-way video interview. And so the Haskayne Career Development Center, we do have a resource called Stand Out. Now, to get access to Stand Out, you will need to go to careerlink.ucalgary.ca, and it'll be right on your dashboard as a Haskayne student. Now, unfortunately, I think it is open to other faculties. I'm not sure if it's open to all faculties, but I know it's open to engineering and Haskayne students. I digress. Standout is a practice tool where we have provided questions for you. You answer them to the webcam, and the program will assess your speed, filler words, and if you use the right keywords in answering that effectively. And I typically recommend students to use Standout over doing an interview with me for one way, because you learn how to self-police yourself during the one-way video interview. It does take practice. They're very bizarre in nature, but it's actually a cost-saving benefit, not just a health benefit, but a cost-saving benefit to both the candidate and the employer. The candidate, remember, think about you being in school at Scurfield Hall between 8 to 5, and a recruiter asks for an interview. You now have to schedule time to run to the train station, grab the train, go downtown, have your interview, come back to campus. That can waste up to 3 hours of your life. One-way video interviews, they give you 48 hours to complete. You do it whenever is applicable to you. So I know a lot of you stay up late. So why not do your interview at 1 in the morning? That was unheard of for in-person interviews. A recruiter would never interview you at 1 in the morning. And so there is a huge advantage for the one-way video interviews. The second type of interview you're going to see is a two-way video interview. So similar to our session today, you would probably be speaking to one or two, maybe even more individuals involved in the process. And so learning how to manage your online presence, having maybe a background, wearing a blazer, having the appropriate lighting, making sure your microphone works, make sure that you don't have any distractions in the home, putting your phone on silent, making sure family members don't open or barge in when you're having that interview. There are a lot of things you can do to mitigate those bigger risks, but the essence of the interview is still the same. The interviewer needs to determine if you're the right fit, not only for the function of the job, but for the culture of the organization. And so the standardized questions would be about the same. In terms of interviews, we have seen some employers, more on the startup and smaller scale, ask for in-person interviews. Always a slippery slope, as I mentioned, similar to in-person interviews, is that you have to see who's comfortable doing what, right? If they want to meet in person or not. And as a candidate, you have way more rights than you think.
Hi, Tania, Farhan here. Thank you so much for all the answers you've given so far. It's been really insightful. I just have one question in relation to networking in general, and especially because now a lot of the in-person networking events are no longer available, and it's difficult to, get your foot in the door and sort of get that contact or set up that informational interview. So I was just wondering if you have any tips in regards to how to go about that in an online environment.
Yeah, so similar to my point earlier, it's not as cookie cutter as it used to be. So it does require a bit of creativity on how to get around that. So there's two, I guess, ways that I see how to get around that is you may see that there are less on campus, so like campus run events. But what you maybe don't see is that employers now have such a liberty to create their own events. And so while we've seen a bit of that shift on our end from the Career Center, we are actually helping employers run their events on their own platforms and how to structure them and how for them to stay competitive in gathering those students. So it's less about access to everyone in a big event like we would typically have on campus, and more about a very specific event for a particular employer. And so what you'll notice on the events calendar on careerlink.ucalgary.ca for both career services, which is our central career center, and the Haskayne School of Business Career Development Center, is that we have a lot of events that we post there that are external, meaning they're hosted by the individual companies. And so that's when it gets a little bit tricky for students, is that you might be completely open to any organization. That's fine, but it is a chance for you to attend those events. So that's number one, is that the scope of the events have changed a bit. The second piece to that, as we talked about it, is networking. Candidates that bypass the applicant tracking system and make connections with a representative from that organization are more likely to get reviewed. And as I mentioned before, during an interview, they determine if you're a good fit for the culture. And oftentimes, referrals are a good way to indicate if someone's a good fit for the culture. So I've been at the University of Calgary and the Haskayne School of Business for 5 years now. And so if I know my job, I know the culture, I know the management style, and if there's someone in my network that I know would thrive in this environment, my manager would take my word for it and help have that candidate move forward in that process. And some students say, well, that's not fair, that's not right. At the end of the day, the employers have to take a risk on you. And sometimes the risk is lowered if someone can vouch for you. And so that's why networking is really important. And students forget that mix, that connection, is knowing someone that works at the organization, whether it's a classmate, an alumni, a hiring manager, whoever. It is really critical to do that. So hopefully that answered your question kind of in two parts.
Okay, thanks, Tania and Farhan, for your question. I think we have time for maybe just one or two last questions. Does anyone want to hop in and ask a question? We're good. Okay, I guess I have one final question. I guess just to wrap it up, what would be some upcoming trends that you know of that are going to be prominent soon in the career path industry? I guess the idea of having a non-traditional career path that's kind of on the rise. So do you have any comments regarding that or anything you would like to elaborate on?
It's a great question. So there are so many factors involved when you look at the external world. So while I don't think that, what do I think? Where do I want to start with this? The biggest thing that I see and I'm just going to make it a generalization about your generation, is that you have been dealing with a tremendous amount of change. And that has not been easy, and it's come with its challenges. But on the flip side, I think it's going to make you a significantly more resilient workforce, coming into work and understanding how bad it could look, how bad it can be. It's going to make you more resilient in terms of changing jobs, deciding to change careers, deciding to come back to school, deciding to challenge the status quo. So while I don't see a huge change per se in how or what your careers will look like, because that's subjective to the market, I think the way you approach life yourself and you approach your own career, you're with that resiliency, you're going to be able to challenge life a lot more in a really positive way. Obviously, people in my generation, we've struggled a lot because we've have these foundational, I guess, career ideas. We have these foundational ways of work, and that's been challenged. Whereas for you, you're more of a blank slate, which is such an advantage, while completely heartbreaking to know that you're experiencing this at this age and stage. I think it'll only lend to really nice things. The other thing too is that Calgary is a huge tech space. We have a lot of tech companies starting up in Calgary. And so I think in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to see a shift. We're no longer going to be an energy hub. We're going to be a tech center. And I've heard the buzzword around, we're the Silicon Valley of Canada, which is really exciting for students, is that you're going to see a quick shift in our industry. So I actually project that students in this generation, you're going to experience more careers in your life than generations before you. As of right now, people change careers anywhere between 5 to 8 times in their life on average. Careers, not jobs, not companies, careers. So I think you're going to be a lot more resilient to those changes.
Okay, yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you, Tania. And I think I really enjoyed this conversation, as well as I got lots to learn about. I'm pretty sure I can take a lot of quotes from this interview and put them into work, and I guess implement them while I am entering the workforce. And I think I can echo that for all the other student executives present here. So thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. And keep being the LinkedIn queen you are.
Well, Thank you so much for having me. This was an absolute pleasure. Always great to see students who are curious and wanting to be better.